a sleepy southern town becomes a place of unimaginable horror as young girls begin disappearing. A cunning serial killer is on the loose, tormenting a family while evading capture. Until investigators could find a way to stop him, he would continue his hunt for more victims.
He was a predator, abducting girls and young women from their own front yards in broad daylight. He was a sadist, phoning one victim's family, taunting them, boosting, then dashing their hope. And he wouldn't stop until we stopped him. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. This serial killer, whoever he was, could pass unnoticed in society. Yet he craved the attention his crimes provided. Somewhere in this contradiction lay the key to his exposure.
May 31st, 1985. The afternoon sun over South Carolina roasted the town of Lexington to a blistering 100 degrees. Sherry Faye Smith had found relief from the heat at a pool party with her boyfriend and fellow high school seniors. She was looking forward to the carefree days between her final exams and graduation. All of summer and the rest of her life awaited the ambitious 17-year-old. She lived with her family in a quiet, rural community, a safe place tucked away on the edge of town. The Smiths' home sat on a generous lot of dense woods. The house was about 200 yards from the road. Sherry's dad, Robert Smith, served as a local pastor. This Friday afternoon, he worked at home in his second-floor office. He looked up from his studies to see his daughter pulling into the driveway and stopping to get the mail. In the next few moments, life in Lexington, South Carolina, changed forever. Expecting Sherry to walk in the house, Mr. Smith looked out the window again. He noticed her car remained near the mailbox, but she was nowhere in sight. Immediately, he felt something was odd. He decided to take a look. Sherry suffered from diabetes. With her blood sugar out of balance, she might become disoriented or incapacitated. When he arrived at the bottom of the driveway, Mr. Smith found Sherry's car still running, and the door swung open.
Sherry?
But his daughter was gone. There was no response to his call.
Sherry?
His mind began to race as he imagined the possibilities. Could she be lying in the woods somewhere, unconscious or in shock?
Sherry?
He yelled louder as he grew more frantic with worry.
Sherry?
There was no sign of her anywhere. Sherry was gone. Mr. Smith immediately called for help. The assistant sheriff of Lexington County responded to the call. The distraught father explained that Sherry was not the type to just run off.
I'm not sure what happened, but how much longer?
She was responsible, warm, and well-adjusted. Not the sort of teenager to run away. But the sheriff took nothing for granted. He questioned Smith about his relationship with his daughter. Today, more than a decade later, Assistant Sheriff Louis McCarty vividly recalls his impressions of the Smith family during his first conversation with Sherry's father.
We discussed his daughter's grades, what kind of child she was. It was determined that there was no animosity between mother and father and daughter. The Smith family was a very, very close-knit family, a very religious family. You just had the sixth sense that they were extremely close, that this child would not have run away on her own.
The investigator couldn't shake the feeling that something bad had happened to Sherry Smith. And the same intuition told him it had nothing to do with her medical condition. Every minute that passed increased the likelihood that Sherry might never be found. Knowing this, the sheriff called for assistance, bypassing the 24-hour waiting period required before officially classifying an individual as a missing person. While waiting for the other officers to arrive, the sheriff and Robert Smith retraced Sherry's steps, careful not to destroy any possible evidence. But the naked eye search yielded nothing. They had to wait for more equipment and expertise. Within minutes, officers from the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, known as SLED, arrived at the Smith home. Investigators combed the scene, looking for tire tracks, foot impressions, or fingerprints. They found nothing. Knowing the next few hours were critical, the authorities assembled a task force and organized a massive ground search. The possibility of an abduction prompted a swift response. Crimes like this simply did not happen. Surrounding counties sent every available officer to help. Word of Sherry's disappearance spread quickly through the close-knit community of Lexington. Hundreds of local residents offered to participate in the search. Still, they found no trace of the young woman. Though there was no direct evidence that a federal crime had been committed, state investigators called on the expertise of the FBI. They wanted the Bureau to unofficially advise in the search and to assist in the investigation. Special Agent John Vollmer from the FBI's Columbia office was dispatched to the Smiths' house the next morning. The disappearance had even baffled the experts.
She was nowhere to be found. And she was not from a type of family background where that would readily indicate she'd run off with somebody. She was from a very stable, good family background, and they immediately thought obviously something had happened to her. But we had no idea at that point what.
The search urgently continued, with hundreds of volunteers and officers working around the clock. It was a daunting task. The heat and terrain hindered the hunt.
When you're talking about looking in a county of 500 square miles, it's almost like looking for a needle in a haystack. It's extremely difficult because you don't know where to begin and where to go.
2 long, hot days of searching passed, and still there was no sign of Sherry. It grew more and more likely that this was an abduction. Horrified that a crime like this could happen in their town, the residents of Lexington were gripped by fear. Children were not seen without their parents. No one went anywhere alone. With every hour that passed, investigators hoped there was still enough time to find Sherry unharmed. On June 3rd, 3 days after Sherry Faye's disappearance, at about 2:30 in the morning, a call disturbed the Smiths' restless sleep. Robert answered the phone. A voice he did not recognize asked for his wife, Hilda.
Hello?
The caller claimed to be Sherry's abductor.
Yes.
The captor apologized for taking Sherry and insisted that she would eventually be returned. He made clear this was not a ransom call. He told Hilda that she would receive a letter in the mail later that day.
Just tell us what you want.
He promised he'd call back and hung up.
He hung up.
Though a phone tap had been set up earlier, the call was too short to get a trace. Sled officers who were at the Smith home called Agent Vollmer immediately.
It really was unclear whether she was alive or dead. The caller was indicating that she was alive, that he would see that she was returned safely. And I think at that point everyone was hopeful that he was truthful and that in fact she was not dead and would be returned to her home and family.
A letter, hopefully containing clues to Sherry's whereabouts, would be a welcome break. But first they had to find out if the letter, promised by the caller, really did exist. Not wasting any time, they woke the town's postmaster and ordered him to open the post office before daybreak. Then they went to work, sifting letter by letter through the piles of outgoing mail.
Long envelope, something similar to this.
After a half hour, the postmaster found an envelope addressed to the Smiths. Carefully, they slipped it into an evidence bag and sent it to the sled forensic labs for analysis. Inside the envelope, examiners found a 2-page letter written on yellow legal paper. Their excitement melted into horror as they began reading the letter. It was entitled, Last Will and Testament. It began, I love you, Mommy, Daddy, Robert, Dawn, and Richard, and everyone else, and all other friends and relatives. My thoughts will always be with and in you. Casket closed. I am sorry if I ever disappointed you in any way. I only wanted to make you proud of me, because I have always been proud of my family. The letter ended with, all my love, always, Sharon, Sherry Faye, Smith. With the help of the Smith family, investigators confirmed that the handwriting was Sherry's. Lab examiners began the painstaking task of analyzing the letter. Searching for prints, hairs, fibers, and other clues would take weeks. While investigators hoped the document might provide other valuable leads, they were alarmed by the letter's content.
We were shocked. We were concerned for her well-being. There were several phrases in the letter that she refers to. One would be casket closed. Is, you know, why would a child make a statement, casket closed?
Sherry's fate was unclear. The abductor had all the answers. He had promised to call again. Until he did, the Smith family clung desperately to hope. Just days after Sherry Faye's disappearance, her abductor had called to taunt the family. Since then, agents and detectives set up a voice recorder in addition to the tap already on the Smith phone. Having the abductor's voice on tape would be invaluable. If the suspect called again, they would be ready. The wait was excruciating. At 8 o'clock on the evening of June 3rd, the phone rang.
Go ahead and answer it and try to stay on the phone as long as possible.
Hello?
It was the voice from the night before. He spoke to Hilda.
Did you receive the letter today?
Yes, I did.
Okay, so you know now that this is not a hoax call.
Yes, I know that.
Okay, listen real carefully. I got to hurry. I know these calls are being traced.
Is Sherry with you?
Sherry is now part of me. Physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, our souls are one now.
Your souls are one now with Sherry?
Yes, and we're trying to work this out. So please do what we ask.
The trace had been successful.
Go ahead, US 1.
The suspect had called from a phone booth about 20 miles away from the Smith home. A network of sheriff's deputies staking out the area raced to the scene, hoping to catch the caller still on the phone. But when they arrived, all they found was a phone dangling off the hook.
Hurry up. Any cars? Give me plates. Any cars leaving the immediate area right now.
He had slipped away, leaving nothing behind, not even fingerprints.
They just missed him.
Sherry's older sister, Dawn, recollects the agonizing uncertainty.
I didn't really understand what was going on at the time. I didn't understand that he was a very sick person. I'd never dealt with anybody like that in my life. But I really believed that he was taking care of her and that there had to be some reason for the madness of Sherry being taken.
On the surface, the abductor's phone conversations revealed nothing about Sherry's whereabouts. However, for the FBI, the phone calls offered the first glimpse inside the mind of this twisted predator. It would be up to FBI profilers in the Investigative Support Unit at Quantico, Virginia, to penetrate this criminal's mind. John Douglas pioneered behavioral profiling for the FBI. He and others developed the investigative tool from over 25 years of interviews with convicted killers, arsonists, rapists, and bombers.
Okay, good. When someone asks for a profile, what they're looking for are characteristics, which includes gender, includes age, race, sometimes body typing, educational level, occupational type.
To determine these characteristics, the profiler attempts to think like the killer. He tries to uncover his motivations. Examining every aspect of a crime reveals patterns of behavior. What emerges is a profile describing the type of person the killer will most likely be. After scrutinizing every detail of Sherry's abduction, Douglas generated a 22-point profile of the suspect. He painted the abductor as a white male, in his late 20s to early 30s, with above-average intelligence. He would most likely work as a blue-collar day laborer. Because it sounded as if the killer had electronically distorted his voice, he probably worked in electrical contracting. He would have a prior criminal record. Douglas also suggested he lived locally. The tone and content of his phone calls indicated he was an asocial obsessive compulsive. If the stress of everyday life became too great, he would break down. He would then feel compelled to compensate for his own inadequacies through violent actions.
He's the type of guy that he feels like one grain of sand on a beach where there are billions and billions of grains of sand. He feels like nothing. He feels like a nobody. And how can this nobody, this personality, this person who's probably overweight, low self-esteem, unattractive, how can he become somebody? He'll go after victims that there was no chance that he would ever come in contact with someone like a Sherry Faye Smith. And so for the first time in their life, they can be powerful.
On Wednesday, June 5th, the Smiths received another call. This time, he gave the family directions to where they would find Sherry.
Listen carefully. Take Highway 378 west to traffic circle. Turn left at white frame building. 6 feet beyond, we're waiting. God chose us.
Investigators raced to the location, hoping they might still find her alive. Six days after her mysterious disappearance, investigators found the body of Sherry Faye Smith.
When the Smith family received the call to the location of the body, we went immediately there, and our worst fears came true.
Sherry's body had been laid in the woods of Saluda County, some 17 miles from the home from which she vanished. Her abductor was now wanted for first-degree murder. A week of 100-degree heat had taken its toll. The body's advanced state of decay worked in the killer's favor. The medical examiner could not determine the exact cause and time of death. To John Douglas, the location and condition of the crime scene provided further insight into the suspect's mind.
He had some criminal sophistication, because I believe what he did is he waited for her to now go into advanced stages of decomposition, which would make it more difficult for law enforcement to determine cause and method of death in this state of decomposition.
The confirmation of Sherry's murder devastated the Lexington community. That Saturday, a crowd of 1,000 mourners attended a funeral service at the town's First Baptist Church. That evening, following Sherry's funeral, the killer could not resist inflicting more torment.
Well, may I speak to Mrs. Smith?
Sherry's Aunt Beverly answered the phone.
I want to speak to Dawn.
I'm sorry, she's not available either.
Beverly stalled him, hoping to gain valuable time for the phone trace.
Yeah, I'll have to go then if I can't talk to her.
But the suspect threatened to hang up if he couldn't immediately speak to Dawn.
Hello?
This thing got out of hand, and all I wanted to do was make love to Dawn. I've been watching her for a couple of
To who?
To Sherry. Dawn, I hope you and your family forgive me for this.
When you killed Sherry, was she at peace? She wasn't afraid or anything?
She was not. She was at peace. She knew that God was with her, and she was going to become an angel.
Overwhelmed with grief, Sherry's mother insisted on talking to her daughter's murderer.
Did you tell her you were going to kill her?
Yes, I did, and I gave her the choice, and she picked suffocation.
My God, how could you?
It did not escape the attention of the FBI and local investigators that the killer had mistakenly used Dawn's name when he spoke of Sherry. They braced themselves for the possibility that this killer might be turning his murderous obsession towards Dawn. But the suspect would make only one more call before falling ominously silent. Though he wasn't talking, they knew he was still out there, terrifying a community. And the profile predicted that if he killed once, he would kill again. In June 1985, FBI investigators continued to hunt the kidnapper and killer of 17-year-old Sherry Smith. While investigators focused on the Smith murder, the elusive Predator pursued other plans. On Friday, June 14th, 2 weeks after Sherry's abduction, a man grabbed Deborah Mae Helmick from her front yard in Richland County as she played with her brother. She was just 9 years old. The child's screaming alerted a neighbor. But the woman was not fast enough. The abductor managed to slip away in broad daylight. Helmick's neighbor could only provide vague information. However, the general description of the suspect and his method appeared eerily similar to the man the FBI wanted for the murder of Sherry. Richland County sheriffs immediately contacted the task force in nearby Lexington.
Within moments of that abduction, we were aware of it and began to focus on that case also. We were pretty much in our minds, I think that everybody knew these two cases were connected.
For John Douglas, the case took on an even greater sense of urgency. Deborah May Helmick's fate seemed almost certain.
Once they get the urge, they're out looking for the preferential victim, but if they cannot find the victim of choice, they will go after whoever is available. And that was the case here with Deborah May Helmick.
News of the second abduction brought Douglas down from Quantico, Virginia to South Carolina. The FBI hoped they could find 9-year-old Deborah May Helmick before her young life was cut short. In the Smith case, the killer's phone calls had been a critical link for the investigators. It had been nearly a week since Deborah's disappearance, and they hadn't heard from him. To get him to call, Douglas devised a plan. With the help of the local media, he would set a trap. One key element of the plan placed Dawn Smith in jeopardy. Douglas had to ask the Smiths to put their other daughter at risk to catch Sherry's killer and hopefully find young Deborah. Dawn agreed.
A lot of times people thought we were twins. We looked a lot alike, and so they came up with this plan that if I were to answer the phone, maybe he would turn that fascination from Sherry to me. And if I could keep him on the phone talking long enough about Sherry, about himself, about anything to keep him on the phone, then they could trace the call and catch him.
Douglas's strategy centered around a memorial service for Sherry. Investigators promoted the service in the local press. The agents hoped the attention to his first victim would rekindle the killer's fascination with Dawn. Douglas needed something else to bait the trap. A personal item from Sherry's room. Based on experience, Douglas knew that sexual predators are often attracted to personal items of their victims. They want mementos that they can keep, even display as trophies. He noticed the koala bear. It was the mascot of the university she planned to attend in the fall. The day of the memorial service, plainclothed agents swarmed the grounds, hoping their suspect would visit the cemetery. As the family's minister delivered a eulogy, Dawn and her parents huddled close. Though Dawn had willingly volunteered to lure the killer to the trap, the danger it presented weighed on everyone's mind. There was no telling what the suspect might do.
The security around Dawn was heightened. We were extremely concerned about Dawn becoming a victim.
Then, as planned, Dawn placed some flowers and the koala bear on her sister's grave. Now all that was left to do was wait. Using Douglas's profile, FBI agents coached Dawn on how to handle the suspect when he called.
I was told to never be threatening, to never be harsh, to be real understanding and sympathetic and compassionate, and I was with him. And I think he liked that because he felt like he was very much in charge, which is something that he thrived on.
Several calls came to the Smith home following the memorial service. Not knowing if it was Sherry's killer, Dawn had to answer every one. Shortly after midnight, the phone at the Smith house rang again.
Hello?
I would like to talk to Dawn Smith from Sherry. Will you take the call?
Yes.
Go ahead, please.
As Douglas had hoped, the culprit took the bait. And, as anticipated, the killer had turned his focus to Dawn.
You can't be protected all the time.
He made it clear to her that she was going to be his next victim.
You know, God wants you to join Cherry Bay. It's just a matter of time. This month.
Despite the threat, Dawn kept him on the line, enduring abuse from the man who murdered her sister, while officials traced the origin of the call.
Richland County?
Yeah, okay, listen carefully. Go 1 north.
Then, before hanging up, the killer offered directions.
Turn right. Deborah May is waiting. God forgive us all.
Special Agent John Vollmer feared that the killer would not stop there.
Once he called about Deborah Helmick, then you're leading into the possibility that you now are dealing with a possible serial killer who has killed now at least 2, you suspect, maybe others before, and may continue to kill others.
Despite Douglas's success at getting the suspect a call, no one had anticipated just how far away the killer would go to avoid detection. Tracing the call from outside the area took additional time. Again, the suspect left the phone booth moments before the authorities could reach him.
We were very, very close to catching him on a number of occasions, and it's almost as if he sensed this and began to move further in making his phone call.
Other investigators followed the caller's directions. There, they found 9-year-old Deborah May Helmick murdered. The gamble had failed. With every missed opportunity, the probability of more victims increased. And now, Dawn was the most likely target. Investigators feared the killer would make an attempt to abduct her. An elusive serial killer had already killed 2 girls around Lexington, South Carolina. The slim amount of evidence frustrated FBI investigators as well as local law enforcement. But the forensic analysis was about to generate the biggest break in the investigation. The last will and testament of Sherry Smith was examined by Gail Heath, director of the Questioned Document section of the South Carolina Law Enforcement Labs. Using an ESDA machine, Heath hoped to find hard evidence. The ESDA, an acronym for Electrostatic Detection Apparatus, can pick up images that are invisible to the naked eye. It works on the opposite principle of a printing press. Instead of coating raised letters with ink to create an image, the ESDA fills in the indentations on the document in question with graphite. When an imaging film similar to Saran wrap is pulled tight over the document, a readable image comes through. After hours of examining the document, Heath found indented writing. It appeared to be a phone number and a name.
The particular name and phone number in question, we were able to bring up the entire area code, the first 3 numbers of the prefix, the next 2 numbers, the 3rd number we were unsure of, and then we had the 4th number.
The name on the pad was Joe. From the area code, investigators determined the number was from Alabama. To fill in the missing digit, investigators called every combination of the phone number until they reached a party who had the same name as the one found on the legal pad. They finally made a match. The number belonged to a man named Joe Shepard. Investigators scrutinized his phone records. They found that he had received a call from an address just outside of Lexington in Lake Murray, South Carolina. Either of these addresses could belong to the killer. Armed with the FBI profile, local police visited the Alabama address.
How you doing? You Mr. Shepard?
They met Joe Shepard. He didn't match the killer's profile. Even though he was not a suspect, he could still be an important link to the killer. Police had to find out the connection between him and the Lake Murray, South Carolina phone call. Shepard explained it came from his parents' home. South Carolina officers verified that the address belonged to Joe Shepard's parents, Ellis and Sharon Shepard. Investigators went to the Lake Murray address to question the residents. The house was just 2 miles from where police found the body of 9-year-old Deborah May Helmick.
10-4.
They learned that Ellis worked as an electrician in home construction. It was a profession the FBI profile predicted. As the officers knocked on the door, a car pulled into the driveway. When investigators saw the Shepards, they immediately felt they had hit another dead end. Besides Ellis Shepard's profession, nothing else seemed to fit the profile. They questioned them anyway. The Shepards told them that they had recently returned from a 6-week trip. The officers casually asked if the couple knew about the Smith and Helmick murders. With every question, the police noticed Mrs. Shepard becoming more concerned. The Shepards were beginning to suspect their house sitter, Larry Jean Bell. As they described Bell, elements of the profile fell into place. He was a white male, in his 30s, who lived with his parents. He sometimes assisted Ellis in home construction. Just days earlier, when the Shepards returned from the vacation, Bell had picked them up from the airport. He talked to the Shepards at length about the cases. He was closely following the news of the murders. It was more evidence of a meticulous mind and behavior consistent with the profile.
They said that he had saved the newspaper articles, told them all about the case in great detail from the airport back to their residence. Again, it was uncanny how much this profile was on track.
The detectives asked if they could see the inside of the house. Suspecting the killer had used a weapon to force Sherry Smith into the car, they asked Ellis Shepard if he owned a gun. Shepard led them to a drawer where he kept his revolver.
Last time I used this gun.
To his surprise, the gun was gone.
Got a good idea.
The officers asked the couple to accompany them to the precinct. They wanted the Shepards to listen to recordings of the killer's calls to the Smith family. The investigators needed to know if the voice on the recordings belonged to their house sitter.
For a couple of months, and then they'd find out I'm sane, and then I'd get tried and get sent to electric chair, put in prison rest of my life. I'm not going to stay in prison rest of my life.
Though the caller may have electronically altered his voice, to the Shepards, it was clear that the man on the tape was their house sitter, Larry Jean Bell.
I filled in all the holes and everything.
We were all extremely elated. We could not show any emotion, but we knew that we had the case at that point. We had our man.
She said 12 or something, but anyway.
The Shepards told the police that they expected Bell to return to their home at 7:30 the next morning for work.
We're going to have Detective Perry take you outside.
Investigators staked out Bell's residence. This time, there was no way he could elude capture. Larry Jean Bell headed down the highway to the Shepards. He failed to notice the unmarked police car following behind him. The officers radioed to another car waiting to cut him off at the approaching intersection. June 26, 1985, at 7:19 a.m., investigators finally trapped the elusive Larry Jean Bell. This time, it was the investigators who were one step ahead. Bell was arrested without resistance and taken to the precinct for questioning. With Bell now in custody, investigators still needed to build an airtight case to make sure he would never be free to kill again. Combining hard forensic evidence with the FBI profile, South Carolina police arrested Larry Jean Bell on suspicion of kidnapping and murder. But now they had to prove beyond any doubt that he was indeed the killer of Sherry Smith and Deborah May Hellman. It was up to Lexington County Solicitor Donald Myers to make the case. A career prosecutor, Myers was determined to convict the killer who had so horrifically taunted his victim's family.
I did not like Larry Jean Bell even before I knew him. And I knew that this was probably the most publicized case that we would ever had, the most publicized in South Carolina up to that time. And I pretty much committed myself to go after him with everything I had.
Though there was powerful evidence against Bell, it was only circumstantial. Still, in the state of South Carolina, a confession could guarantee the maximum sentence. Myers needed to make sure that Bell would never be able to take another life. He wanted a confession. Again, they called on the FBI to help. They recommended setting up an interrogation room that would elicit a self-incriminating statement.
For instance, a map showing where the phone calls were made, some pictures of the victim so that he's aware as he looks about the room to remind him of the victim. You might have fingerprint cards on the table. You might have notebooks or file cabinets that would have his name on them, all to make him think you obviously have narrowed in on him, you've got the goods on him, he might as well go ahead and give it up.
While the officers prepared to question Bell, other detectives secured a search warrant for the Shepherd's house. For the next 12 hours, the forensic team combed every square inch of the home, looking for anything that would firmly connect Bell to the crimes. As the profile predicted, the house was in perfect order. It was meticulously cleaned, vacuumed, and dusted, particularly in the room where Larry Jean Bell had been staying. But beneath the orderly exterior, the team uncovered evidence of his deviance. The bed's pristine sheets concealed a thin, dirty mattress, and beneath that lay a porn magazine and a handgun that matched the description of Mr. Shepherd's missing .38. Despite the freshly vacuumed carpets, an investigator retrieved a blonde hair in the space where a vacuum cleaner wouldn't reach. A lab would match the strand to Sherry Smith.
Well, how are you this afternoon?
While the investigators continued the search for evidence at the Shepherd's home, detectives at the interrogation carried out the FBI's strategy. First, they made sure Bell was comfortable. As advised by Douglas, they spoke to the suspect in a non-threatening way. They pretended to empathize with him, to understand his pain, in order to pry him open. They walked their suspect through the growing mound of evidence condemning him. At every chance, they reminded him of the victims. Bell denied everything. However, he did make a curious request. He wanted to meet Dawn and Hilda Smith. Hoping the mother and sister of his first victim might stir a confession, the Smiths agreed. Hilda and Dawn tried to mentally prepare themselves. Finally, they stepped into the room and came face to face with Sherry's killer.
He began to mumble and he began to speak about how he was sorry that the person sitting in that chair couldn't have been the one that had done this. But another Larry Bell could have been the one. He really didn't make a lot of sense. And so I remember sitting there, I remember looking at him, I remember listening to him, and I really just felt disgust. That I knew this was the man. And he wasn't even man enough to say, I did it, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to make excuses. But my mom said the most incredible thing to him. She said, I know you're the man that killed my daughter, and I can honestly say that I don't hate you. And he got teary.
But Bell's emotional break went only to the point of tears. He never made the confession authorities wanted. After weeks of compiling evidence, Myers and the investigators began to piece together the sequence of events of May 31st, 1985. Bell noticed Sherry Smith after dropping his mother off at a doctor's appointment. Something about the young woman triggered his lecherous cravings. As she left the parking lot, Bell followed. His desire shattered what little restraint he possessed. He never let her out of his sight. Sherry did not notice the car following her down the road. She pulled into the driveway and stopped at the mailbox. Bell wasted no time. He had taken Sherry completely by surprise.
Come on, you're going with me!
He brought Sherry to the Shepherd's house on Lake Murray. Bell then canceled dinner with friends. He told them he wanted to stay at the Shepherd's and watch a baseball game. He had already tied Sherry to the bed. The evidence showed that Sherry had been raped. Before killing her, Bell coerced Sherry to write her last will and testament. "12 hours after she disappeared, he covered her mouth with duct tape and suffocated her. Investigators believed that she was dead by 4:58 a.m., the time Bell claimed that their souls became one. It took less than 1 hour for 12 South Carolinians to find Bell guilty of first-degree murder. Myers prosecuted Bell in a separate trial for the murder of 9-year-old Deborah May Helmick. He was found guilty a second time. With Bell's conviction, the Smith family could begin to rebuild their lives.
There was a sense of relief that, okay, now he can't do this to me, he can't do this to anybody else, and he will be put away.
Larry Gene Bell paid the ultimate price for his sadistic crimes. On October 4th, 1996, he was put to death in South Carolina's electric chair. Though the loss of Sherry Smith and Deborah May Helmick will always be felt, life in Lexington has slowly returned to normal. With skill and determination, the South Carolina law enforcement community and the FBI brought closure to a grieving town by ending the deadly game of cat and mouse.
As crack cocaine tore through Washington, D.C., a drug gang fought to take control.
What up? Man, papers at.
Authorities fought back with everything they had. But gang members used any means to avoid prosecution. As the violence raged out of control, law enforcement would take back the streets.
In the early 1990s, Washington, D.C. became the murder capital of the nation. Few were left untouched by gang violence, which was ignited by the drug trade. By 1994, that violence would strike at the very heart of law enforcement. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. Would fall to the FBI to lead an international manhunt and bring in the leader of the city's most vicious gang.
October 26, 1994. The nation's capital was about to become the backdrop to another bloody crime. Just before midnight, 3 masked gunmen broke into a home in the northwest section of the city.
Get up! Get up! Get up! Now! Get up!
They targeted Gerald Gaither, demanding his cash and drugs.
Where's the money? Where's the money? Where's the money? Where's it at? Where's the money?
He turned over what little money he had in his pockets.
Get up!
The owner of the home, William Ragland, was accosted while working in his basement.
Where's the money at? Get out here.
Upstairs, one of the gunmen discovered Nancy Hatchett and Darlene Hatchett, Ragland's daughter and granddaughter.
Get out there. Go!
To convince Gaither to cooperate, the gunmen terrorized each of the residents.
Get out! Get out!
The women were ordered to lie face down on the floor.
Get out! Hands out! Tell us, come on, old man. Come on, old man. Tell us where the money is. Where is it? Where is it?
Gaither denied having more cash or drugs.
Put your hands down now.
One of the gunmen turned his .22 caliber handgun towards Ragland. The 89-year-old retired federal worker died instantly.
Tell us where it is. Play games.
Andre Madison, another resident, was hustled into the living room.
Shut up.
One of the 3 attackers noticed his gold necklace and ripped it from his neck.
Get down. Get out. Get out. Face down. Face down. Shut up. Shut up.
Though one man was dead, Gaither still refused to cooperate.
Get out. Get out. What are you doing?
Enraged, one of the gunmen began shooting the residents. The robbery attempt collapsed into murder. The trio quickly fled the house. One of the attackers vomited near the back door. Nancy Hatchett called 911. Officers from D.C.'s Metropolitan Police Department quickly arrived at the house, located in a known drug area. Inside, 3 people were dead. William Ragland, his granddaughter Darlene Hatchett, and Gerald Gaither. Pictures were taken of each body, and shell casings were collected. Outside, police discovered vomit near the door.
Hey, how you doing?
Nancy Hatchett and Andre Madison, the only survivors, tried to help police develop suspects. But the attackers were masked, making identification difficult.
Okay.
For Metropolitan Homicide Detective Anthony Brigadini, a check on victim Gerald Gaither suggested a possible motive.
The main victim of the triple was a drug dealer in the First and Kennedy Street area. The guy drove flashy cars, had nice clothes, had a lot of money. When the drug dealer was unable to give them enough money and or drugs, things started to get a little harried, and that's when the shootings occurred inside.
Neighbors told police that after hearing gunshots, they saw a dark-colored sedan with a loud muffler leaving the area. An all-points bulletin was issued for the vehicle and 3 men inside. One hour after the murders, 2 D.C. cops spotted a noisy vehicle that fit the report. Noticing 3 men inside the vehicle, the officers pulled over the gray Oldsmobile. The police asked the men for identification. The driver was identified as Benny Lee Lawson. The passengers were determined to be Kobe Mowat and Jermaine Graves. In one of their pants pockets, police recovered a broken gold necklace. But details from the murder scene were still incomplete. To the officers, the necklace was meaningless. After recording all of the men's names and addresses, the 3 were soon released. There was no evidence in the car to connect them to the murders. Despite the lack of solid suspects, homicide detectives believed that Gerald Gaither had been murdered by a rival drug gang. By 1990, crack cocaine had hit the streets in Washington, D.C. Neighborhood gangs began to emerge throughout the city when it became clear that there was a lot of money to be made from dealing the drug. As more and more money flowed to the gangs, they resorted to violence to protect their turf from rival drug dealers. By 1994, the nation's capital was averaging nearly 400 homicides a year. DC police joined forces with the FBI and several federal agencies to combat the drug-related violence. Most of the murders remained unsolved. Hoping to rattle free a lead in the triple murder, detectives began canvassing the neighborhood where the murders took place. Neighbors were too afraid to openly cooperate. Some were willing to phone in information anonymously. One tip led to Benny Lee Lawson, one of the 3 men pulled over the night of the homicides. Investigators learned that the gold necklace taken from Andre Madison matched the one officers found on one of the men in Lawson's car. Detective Brigadini questioned Lawson.
Lawson's interview lasted about 3 or 4 hours, and different detectives went in and spent some time with Lawson in an attempt to get him to provide some sort of information about his involvement in the triple murder.
Sit down. Look at me.
Lawson repeatedly denied having any knowledge of the triple murder and refused to take a polygraph test. Investigators tried to shake his story with the false threat that they could put him at the murder scene through a DNA test of the recovered vomit. Lawson remained unswayed. After 4 hours, police had no choice but to release him. Lawson's name was run through the crime database. He had been identified by police intelligence units as a member of one of DC's most violent and feared street gangs. The 1st and Kennedy Street Crew, named after the city blocks the group lived on and controlled. Organized in 1988, the crew was involved in drug dealing, theft, kidnappings, drive-by shootings, and murder. The men with Benny Lawson the night of the murders, Kobe Mowat and Jermaine Graves, confronted him about the long hours he spent with the homicide detectives. They believed he had snitched and told the police about the gang's involvement in the triple murder. Lawson was infuriated by the accusation. He hated the police. He assured the 2 that he had revealed nothing to investigators. Since no arrests had been made, Graves was confident the cops had no evidence. Mowat was not as sure. He declared that he would leave the country rather than be indicted for murder. Lawson vowed he would never go back to prison where he once had been raped.
What they asking?
Lawson returned home that night. Being labeled a snitch was an insult to his loyalty towards the crew. And for a gang member on the streets, it was a death sentence. He was committed to gaining back the respect of the crew, proving that he was not a snitch. On November 22nd, 1994, a few days before Thanksgiving, Benny Lawson returned to Metropolitan Police Department headquarters. It was around 3:15 p.m. He was trying to locate the homicide department he had visited several days earlier.
Hey.
He asked two teenagers for directions.
Yeah, we're going that way, through that door right there.
They mistakenly led him to the cold case squad.
Okay, well, we'll see you
The
then.
team inside the office was made up of personnel from the MPD and the FBI, whose job was to breathe life into the growing number of unsolved homicide investigations. Inside the office were FBI agents Martha Dixon Martinez, John Kufta, Mike Miller, and Metropolitan Police Sergeant Hank Daly. The teenagers, who were there for a scheduled appointment, began to speak with the officers. With no warning, Lawson pulled out his M11 assault handgun and started firing. The headquarters of the Washington, D.C. police was under attack. Repeated gunfire echoed through Washington, D.C. police headquarters. Detectives raced to the third-floor office where the shooting continued. No one knew what was going on behind the locked doors of the cold case squad room.
Come on, open up the door! Open up the door!
Across town at the FBI's Washington field office,
Hey, Tony, what do you have? All right, I'll talk to you later.
It was just a normal day like any other day, and we were monitoring one of the police radios, and we heard a call go out that there had been a shooting at MPD headquarters.
Okay, we're on our
agents
way.
quickly determined the shooting was taking place inside the cold case office, where several FBI agents were on duty.
And very quickly we started to page our agents that were assigned to the cold case homicide squad to try to account for all of them. And as time progressed, we weren't hearing back from some of the agents, and we realized that we might have some agents inside there. And as we listened, the calls became more serious and they were requesting assistance.
Critically wounded, Special Agent John Kufta was trapped inside the cold case squad office. When the shooting had stopped, he could hear the shouts from officers outside the office trying to get in. Help was just a few feet away.
At that point, I heard a voice tell me they couldn't get in, and I thought to myself, I'm not going to die in here. I thought of, my wife, my 8-month-old daughter at the time, and I knew that if I stayed awake, if I continued to breathe, if I continued to pray, and if they got me to a hospital, I'd be alive.
Shot in the thigh, arm, stomach, neck, and chest, Kufta managed to open the door. Detectives pulled him out. The only other visible person to the rescuers was Metropolitan Police Sergeant Hank Daly. Barely clinging to life, he was dragged from the room. He was rushed outside where a helicopter waited to transport him to the hospital. Not knowing if the shooter was planning another ambush, the officers waited for the SWAT team to arrive. FBI agents and SWAT teams from around the Capitol converged on the Metropolitan Police headquarters. Yells continued from inside the room as the SWAT team arrived. Heavily armed, They entered the room. They first discovered FBI agent Mike Miller's body. His weapon was still in its holster. In an adjoining room, the SWAT team discovered the body of an unidentified black male. There was a gunshot wound on his hip and a fatal wound to his head. FBI agent Martha Dixon Martinez was the final victim found. She had gunshot wounds in her back. Near her lay the gun the shooter had likely used to kill her and the others, an M11 assault weapon. Shouts for help came from inside a closet.
Suspect in the closet, open the door slowly!
Not knowing if he was a suspect or an innocent bystander, the SWAT team apprehended one of the teens who had walked in the room before the shooting began. The other teenager had managed to flee the office earlier after being shot in the leg.
I don't even know the guy.
Supervisory Special Agent Mark Giuliano and other agents arrived at the scene.
I just remember walking through the hallway and just seeing the chaotic scene and the blood and just the total realm of emotions on everybody's face, from being focused on the mission of trying to figure out what happened and could there be other people involved.
Based on the crime scene analysis, investigators quickly reconstructed what had happened inside the room.
Getting all those shells over there?
Yes.
After Miller, Kufta, and Daly were ambushed, Agent Dixon Martinez joined the firefight. She was able to shoot the suspect in the hip before being shot in the arm, dropping her gun. The attacker took her 9mm handgun and shot the agent in the back as she tried to crawl for cover. He then put the gun to his own head and pulled the trigger. Police fingerprinted the shooter. Hopefully his identity would shed light on his actions. 2 FBI agents were dead. Sergeant Hank Daly would not survive his injuries. It would be the first time in 8 years that more than one FBI agent had been killed at a single time. It was also one of the worst attacks in history on the DC police. Agent Kufta would endure 7 major medical operations before recovering. The loss of his co-workers, Sergeant Hank Daly, Agents Mike Miller and Martha Dixon Martinez, was devastating.
Martha, Mike, and Hank were law enforcement heroes. They didn't as much lose their lives as gave their lives for a cause of justice, for a cause that they so deeply believed.
Within hours, the investigation was moving forward. The fingerprints of the shooter had come back.
When the information came up about the identity of the shooter, a detective had the information, came into a conference area where the majority of the homicide officials and detectives were, and it was announced that the shooter was Benny Lee Lawson, Jr.
When homicide detective Anthony Brigadini heard the news, he realized his squad was the probable target of Lawson's rampage. Lawson and the 1st and Kennedy Street crew were the prime suspects in the triple murder of William Ragland, Darlene Hatchett, and Gerald Gaither. The shootings at headquarters showed just how far the gangs would go to protect themselves.
I think that law enforcement as a whole has learned that people operating gangs or crews are serious about what it is that they're doing. They won't stop at any cost to get their mission accomplished.
Now that federal officers had been murdered, the FBI was given jurisdiction in the investigation of the crew.
Let's go. I was detailed to work jointly with the FBI to investigate the 1st and Kennedy Street crew, who at that time we felt were responsible for essentially Lawson's actions here at police headquarters.
After joining the task force, Brigadini shared what he knew about Benny Lawson and the crew. Special Agent John Kerr was on the team. For him, Benny Lawson's connection with the First and Kennedy Street crew raised serious questions.
Was this just a random act by Benny Lee Lawson, or were there accomplices? Did he have any help in this? Were there be any further attacks on agents and police? And so that was a reason that we opened up an investigation to answer those questions. Was this a conspiracy?
Investigators obtained a search warrant that night for the house Lawson had lived in.
Please get out! Please get out!
In his room, they uncovered a note written to the members of the DC homicide unit who had interrogated him, threatening to kill them.
All right, there.
Gang-related materials, violent rap lyrics, and drawings of murders were everywhere. For investigators, the items in Lawson's room reflected a fixation with violence common to virtually all gang members.
It was very obvious and disturbing that these individuals were living this lifestyle. This is the lifestyle that they were a part of. This is the lifestyle that they identified with, and they wanted to actually live the same lifestyle as the lyrics that they were writing, the pictures they were drawing, and the videos that they had.
As the victims of the shootings were laid to rest, investigators were planning their strategy to ensure that these gang members could never kill again. With 6 homicides on their hands, including 2 FBI agents and a Washington, D.C. police detective, a joint FBI MPD task force began gathering information on the First and Kennedy Street crew. FBI agent Mark Giuliano headed up the task force.
And our goal was to, A, investigate the crew because they were a violent street gang, and B, to try to determine what the motivation was of Benny Lee Lawson to come into police headquarters and do what he did, and to determine if there was anybody else involved at either end, either in helping him get there to pull off what he did or helping the crew afterwards to cover up what had happened.
In the wake of the shootings at MPD headquarters, police pressure on gang members increased. The crew members reacted by spending less time on the streets. Building a case against them for their criminal activity would be difficult. The crew was impenetrable to outsiders. Planting an undercover agent inside the gang was too dangerous.
What we realized is that, A, we had a very close crew. That is, they took care of each other and watched each other very closely, but they were very, very leery of outsiders. They had been leery before, but they were even more leery now, and that any attempts for us to get somebody, an agent or a police officer on the inside, was not something that we were going to even attempt to do.
Instead, agents would have to gather intelligence on the crew through covert surveillance. As time went on, the gang returned to business as usual. The FBI was watching.
We had extensive surveillance coverage of the area, day and night, identifying everyone that came onto the block, identifying who the buyers were, what time of day, where did they go when they bought, did they get into a car, did they go into an alleyway, did they do it hand to hand right there in front of you. All these things we started to take notice of and document.
Through surveillance, the leaders of the crew were soon identified. Kobe Mowat and his second-in-command, Jermaine Graves, the 2 men in the car with Benny Lawson the night of the first triple homicide. On the streets, Mowat was known to be violent and unpredictable.
The reputation of Kobe Mowat was that of fear, that he would react quickly. At times he had a temper. He always carried a gun and could be extremely violent at times.
Looking into Kobe's past, investigators discovered he shared a common history with Graves and with Benny Lawson. Their relationship developed in 1990 while serving together in Washington, D.C.'s Lorton Prison, located in Northern Virginia. They had been arrested and convicted for weapons violations while preparing for a drive-by shooting on another gang.
Do you know what happened to me here?
The task force members were convinced that Mowat and Graves played some role in all 6 murders. But the leaders of the First and Kennedy Street crew continued to keep a low profile. Agents devised a long-term strategy that would net not only Mowat and Graves, but also the entire gang membership. They would slowly build a conspiracy case against the crew that would include the entire range of their criminal activities, from crack cocaine trafficking to murder.
Off the street, well, back in 4:30. Hang on to those for me.
Agents would work themselves inside by first targeting individuals who regularly purchased their drugs from the crew. This would allow them to watch and record the gang committing crimes. And by arresting the buyers, agents would have leverage to turn them into informants.
We'd come into an area when we thought that they'd be the most active in selling drugs. And in order to identify someone and hopefully get lucky, catch someone with some drugs, and maybe force them to work for us at some point.
Some of the buyers arrested were unwilling to cooperate at first. The dangerous reputations of Mowat and Graves were well known. But the threat of long prison sentences was powerful. The FBI strategy paid off. Threatened with significant jail time, one of the biggest drug suppliers to the crew decided to become an informant. At the FBI's direction, he would generate conversation with crew members about their illegal activities.
And he'd have conversations with them, and they like to brag about what they've done. And at our direction, he would bring something up, say an old drive-by shooting or an old murder, or something about drug dealing. And these individuals would just start to talk about it. They'd talk about who was involved, what happened. All of this was being recorded.
Through the informant and the recordings, agents learned that Mowat, Graves, and Lawson had killed previously. Less than 3 weeks before breaking into William Ragland's house, they had kidnapped and murdered another rival drug dealer.
What up, boy? What up? Huh?
William Red Billy Woods was a well-known dealer from a rival gang. Jermaine Graves arranged to lure Woods to his mother's house. Once there, Mowat, Graves, and Lawson robbed him and beat him. Fearing the rival gang would retaliate against the crew, they shot him 3 times and dumped his body in the road.
You can go down.
Agents also heard testimony from another informant that further implicated Mowat, Graves, and Lawson in the triple murder at William Ragland's house.
Down where? First and Kennedy? Huh?
He overheard Benny, Kobe, and Jermaine Graves talking about the triple homicide. And one of the things that he mentioned that they were giving Benny a hard time for was the fact that he threw up at the scene of the triple homicide. That's something that only the homicide detectives knew and that we knew and had not been released to the public.
The information was only circumstantial, but months of surveillance and informant testimony gave agents enough evidence to obtain a search warrant for the homes of Kobe Mowat and Jermaine Graves. They would strike at Jermaine Graves first. A heavily armed SWAT team made their way inside his house.
Please get down!
No one was there.
Oh, one more.
Agents would not leave empty-handed.
We were able to locate a 9mm gun, semi-automatic pistol, as well as some crack cocaine, what we believe to be crack cocaine. One of the members on the squad took the information that we got from the gun and put together an affidavit for an arrest warrant based on the fact that it was a convicted felon in possession of a firearm.
For several weeks, Graves eluded investigators. They continued surveillance, hoping that he would turn up.
We really didn't know where he was. We had some ideas. We knew he was still in the metro area, but obviously he knew once we hit his house that we were looking for him, and word was out on the street that we were looking for him, so he was keeping a very low profile. During one of our very standard surveillances, I saw an individual who walked like Jermaine Graves, just from the back. I couldn't see his face. So I asked one of the units to drive around the block and just take a look at the guy. And the next thing I know, they jumped out and arrested him. They knew as soon as they pulled around the corner it was him. And you know, he was arrested right on the street corner of 1st and Kennedy.
Just a few months after the first triple murder, Graves was off the streets. Making a case against Kobe Mowat would prove more difficult. With the arrest of gang member Jermaine Graves on a weapons charge, the FBI task force was one step closer to taking the 1st and Kennedy crew off of the Washington, D.C. streets. Now agents were ready to serve a search warrant on the home of the crew's leader, Kobe Mowat. A SWAT team entered the house Kobe shared with his twin brother Kareem. The two never knew what hit them. Investigators found gang-related documents, drawings, and writings, and a small amount of marijuana. They found no guns or evidence of the murders. But that was not their prime interest. The task force hunted for evidence of a larger crime pattern.
Gang videos, bad videos everywhere.
Most of the evidence we were looking for at the time was list of crew members, shirts that they all wore with the logo on them, pictures, phone books, things that would associate this group together.
The twins were arrested on drug charges and taken in for booking. Kobe's time in jail was brief. Only his brother Kareem's fingerprints were on the bag of pot. Kobe was released and the possession charge was dropped. Agents were determined to see him back behind bars.
You know what?
Investigators continued developing informants from within the gang.
You know you're supplying these guys with drugs, with guns.
They got the break they were looking for. Facing jail time on a drug charge, a member of the 1st and Kennedy crew agreed to cooperate. Finally, investigators learned the answer to the question that had most plagued them. Why did Benny Lee Lawson go into police headquarters and kill 2 FBI agents and an MPD sergeant?
Yeah, Jimmy.
It started the night Kobe Mowat, Jermaine Graves, and Benny Lee Lawson broke into the home of William Ragland. The trio's plan had been to rob drug dealer Gerald Gaither. Jermaine Graves became frustrated by Gaither's refusal to cooperate, and he snapped, killing 3 of the residents. Overwhelmed, Benny Lawson vomited outside the home. To Mowat, it was a sign of weakness.
Jimmy, man, you was going on.
The informant continued. When Lawson was brought in for questioning by investigators, Mowat was sure Lawson had snitched. He began to tell others in the crew that Lawson was cooperating.
He was sitting around, you know, we was at the barbershop.
Benny hated snitches. He hated them. He actually pistol whipped one individual whom he thought was snitching, and probably hated him more than any other crew member. So to have Kobe think that he was ratting or snitching on him, and to go out to 1st and Kennedy Street crew and have the rest of the crew look at him as a snitch, we believe was more than he could handle.
Really?
For agents and investigators, it was now clear that Kobe Mowat, Jermaine Graves, and Benny Lawson had committed the triple homicide. Agents took their case to the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Through these conversations and the cooperating witnesses, plus the information that the police had from the car stop the night of the triple murder, left us no doubt that they had enough to get a murder warrant for these guys for the triple murder.
It was also clear that Kobe Mowat was part of the reason Benny Lee Lawson murdered 3 investigators inside the Metropolitan Police Department. Agents finally felt ready to go before a grand jury and present their conspiracy case against Kobe Mowat and the entire crew. Among the 57 charges that were handed down were indictments for nearly a dozen homicides, drug trafficking, armed robbery, kidnapping, and racketeering. Already in custody, Graves was charged with 3 counts of felony murder. An arrest warrant was issued for Kobe Mowat. Investigators returned to his house. This time, he wasn't home. The closets had been emptied. The place looked like it had been abandoned. In the trash, investigators found a receipt for a plane ticket. It appeared that Kobe had kept his promise to flee rather than go to jail.
And the plane ticket was for just a few days before we hit the place. And the plane ticket was from New York to Moscow. And at that point, we knew that Kobe had most likely fled not only the area, but most likely the country.
Mowat was one step ahead of the agents. They tried to pick up his trail in Russia, but he was nowhere to be found. Investigators discovered there was a flight departing to Africa soon after he landed in Moscow. A check of the passenger list revealed nothing.
There you are, sir.
Agents grew increasingly more frustrated. Mowat was slipping away. For 6 months, FBI agents and Washington, D.C. police tried to track fugitive Kobe Mowat. He could be hiding anywhere. An international manhunt was underway.
We literally went months without a break. We went through hundreds and hundreds of documents that we had obtained during search warrants, during various parts of the investigation, looking for overseas phone numbers, looking for overseas relatives, once again, without a break.
After several months, Agent John Kerr got a break. Through an informant, he uncovered the name of an ex-girlfriend of Kobe's.
We had come up with addresses for one of the addresses we came up with. We subpoenaed the toll records, and sure enough, we found a collect call from Kenya on one of her toll records. And this was shortly after he would have arrived in Africa.
Agents brought her in for questioning. She repeatedly denied knowing anything about Kobe Mowat's whereabouts.
He's out killing people.
Agents confronted her about the phone records. If she continued to withhold information, they would serve her with a grand jury subpoena. She decided to cooperate. She told investigators that Kobe had in fact called her several times from Nairobi, Kenya. He had not called her recently. She believed he might have moved on to Tanzania. The information was immediately passed on overseas.
You have to know where he is.
Mowat's phone call to his ex-girlfriend had originated from a hotel in Nairobi. A U.S. Department of State regional security officer in Kenya followed the lead.
We know he stayed in your hotel.
The hotel owner said he had no recollection of Kobe Mowat. Agent Giuliano received the news.
And it becomes very, very frustrating because, once again, we're getting no new information. We're not getting a break. And we know that the only tie that we have now is this hotel in Nairobi, Kenya. So we go back to the regional security officers and ask them to go back out and re-interview the individual.
Again, the hotel owner insisted he knew nothing about Kobe Mowat. When shown photographs, he seemed to hesitate. The regional security officer kept pressing. Finally, the owner asked for a guarantee that if he gave information, Kobe would never be told. The regional security officer agreed to protect him. He said Kobe had in fact been to his hotel, but he had left several months ago. He gave the security officer a number that Kobe had called while at the hotel. The call was to the East African country of Tanzania. It took agents a few days to determine why the hotel owner protected the First and Kennedy Street crew leader.
What we determined is that Kobe's mother was educated in Jamaica, and during that process she had befriended several individuals who ended up going to various parts of the world. She had an association with this hotel owner in Nairobi, and she had made the contact to protect Kobe and to help him.
You have a nice day. Thank you.
The phone number in Tanzania eventually led investigators to a local college professor. He was a friend of Kobe Mowat's mother. The FBI asked the Tanzanian National Police Department to follow the lead. The professor was unwilling to cooperate with the authorities.
Certainly not a student.
The National Police began their own investigation into Kobe Mowat's whereabouts in their country. As the search for the gang leader intensified in Tanzania, agents and police in Washington, D.C. continued to build their case against the First and Kennedy crew. They amassed volumes of evidence through surveillance and informant testimony over the previous year.
There were about 20 to 25 Metropolitan Police Department officers and FBI special agents working on this investigation around the clock, whether it was determining phone records or uncovering new murders that these guys had committed over the years.
On September 14th, 1995, officers and agents executed over a dozen arrest warrants. They searched for any indication of the gang leader's whereabouts in Africa. They found nothing. They collected additional evidence of a criminal enterprise. They confiscated financial records, guns, drugs, and gang paraphernalia.
Stay right there. Don't move.
Some of those arrested agreed to cooperate in exchange for less jail time. Investigators were slowly taking all of the gang members off the streets. In Tanzania, the search for Kobe Mowat was heating up. The National Police Force developed their own informants and learned that Mowat had in fact been in contact with a university professor.
I don't know anything about Kobe. Perhaps I could take you on a small...
They returned to interview him. He once more denied knowing anything about Kobe. Threatening the Jamaican-born professor with deportation, the Tanzanian police convinced him to reconsider. Finally, he admitted to helping Mowat find a place to hide out. He offered to take the authorities there.
And this hut is literally out in the middle of the tribespeople who are living in straw huts or are actually just living on the ground, right amongst the wild animals and amongst where they grow their crops.
It was the last place on earth authorities would have thought to look for Mowat. Unaware that the professor had betrayed his location, Mowat was surprised to see the police approaching his hut. He set fire to anything that could potentially identify him. But the police quickly moved in and doused the flames.
What did I do?
While they searched for a reason to place him in custody, they never told Mowat why they were there.
They also determined that out in the back, he's growing a small amount of marijuana, or what they call bangi. And in that part of the country, it's against the law. And the penalty is 10 years in prison or $100. So they brought him in based on that premise, telling him that he was going to be incarcerated for that.
Investigators in Washington received the news that Mowat was in custody, but time was working against them. The Tanzanian police could only hold Kobe on the possession charge for a short period. As a drug trafficker, Mowat had plenty of cash on hand to pay the $100 fine. After days of diplomatic wrangling, the arrangements for Mowat's extradition to the United States were finalized. Agent Giuliano and Detective Brigadini traveled to Tanzania to take him into custody. Investigators were finally face to face with the man who had eluded them for over a year.
When he came in, Kobe looked tired, and he looked like he had been defeated. We explained to him what the charges were, that he was being removed to the United States, that he had been indicted in the United States for a variety of charges, including several counts of first-degree murder and racketeering.
Mowat was on his way back to the United States, where he and fellow gang members faced 57 indictments. Kobe Mowat and Jermaine Graves would be convicted on all counts. They were each sentenced to 35 years in a federal prison. Mowat's capture in Africa allowed investigators to get the remaining First and Kennedy crew members off the streets.
When we brought Kobe back to the United States, he just had a domino effect on the rest of the crew members. Eventually, every crew member pled guilty because they felt and actually told us that once they saw that we had found Kobe in East Africa and brought him back, that they felt they didn't stand a chance.
FBI agents and DC police worked tirelessly to bring justice to the victims of gang violence. But this case was also personal. Only after the entire gang was in jail could they have a sense of closure and feel they had vindicated the deaths of their friends. Sergeant Hank Daly and FBI agents Mike Miller and Martha Dixon Martinez. For Agent John Kufta, who barely survived the attack at police headquarters, the implications of this case were far-reaching.
When this group was locked up, I think it sent a clear message to other criminal organizations out there operating in the District of Columbia and in that tri-state area there, that the FBI and the DC police will go to whatever lengths are necessary if it takes them to other continents to track you down and find you and bring you back to the United States to justice.
A Labor Day weekend turned into a nightmare of murder as a cross-country crime spree terrorized the nation. A pair of suspected spree killers traveled through state after state, leaving murder victims in their wake. Working against time, the FBI and local authorities marshaled their resources to stop the killings.
In a small Ohio community, an elderly woman and a teenage boy disappeared. Because they vanished within hours of each other, police believe the cases were linked, but they didn't know how. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. A trail of stolen vehicles and murder victims across 7 states led the FBI in a hunt for 2 serial killers. Their only hope of stopping them was to anticipate the killer's next move.
August 29th, 1994. Summer was drawing to a close in the small town of Port Washington, Ohio. The peaceful farming community was dotted with isolated rural homes. A 79-year-old widow, Ruth Loader, lived alone. Those of her family that lived nearby kept a close eye on Mrs. Loader since she was battling with cancer. When she heard footsteps in the kitchen, she thought it might be her granddaughter returning to see her before she went to sleep. She discovered strangers instead. The following morning, the Tuscarawas County Sheriff's Office received an urgent call from Mrs. Loader's sister. As was their routine, Mrs. Loader's sister and son-in-law came to check on the sick woman, but found Mrs. Loader and her car missing. Sheriff Walter Wilson, a detective lieutenant at the time, was the lead investigator.
Family members had seen Mrs. Loader the evening prior to the morning of her disappearance. She was fine at that time. They had indicated to us that Mrs. Loader was recovering from cancer surgery, that she definitely needed medication, which was left behind.
The family was worried since Mrs. Loader was so weak. She would become very ill if she was without her medication for long.
Go ahead and go with him.
Marks on the back door and damage to the door frame indicated it had been kicked in. The forced entry told the sheriff that the frail woman had not left of her own free will. Mrs. Loader's purse was left behind, but her cash was missing, along with the keys to her red Buick. Sheriff Wilson immediately issued an all-points bulletin for the widow and her car.
Sheriff's Department.
He knew that they'd have the best chance of finding her alive if they acted quickly.
We felt very early on that Mrs. Loader obviously had been kidnapped. We immediately began a massive search for Mrs. Loader and her car. Then that involved all of the area law enforcement agencies. It involved numerous fire department personnel. Citizens from the area came out in droves and helped with the search for Mrs. Loader.
And I need you two to work rush. We're going to try to stay in this general area.
Concerned over her fate, the community was united in its pursuit. The command center was formed in the Port Washington Fire Station, where authorities worked with volunteers to plan the urgent search for the ailing woman. If she didn't have her medicine soon, her condition could become critical. They had to find the grandmother before it was too late.
Report back here every 2 hours and let us know, okay?
Mrs. Loader was pretty well known in that area. It's a very good family. They're very highly thought of, and everyone was very concerned for her and felt obligated and really sincerely wanted to try to find her to help her.
Mounted reserve units geared up to comb rougher terrain on horseback. Local police and neighbors searched fields and woods for any trace of her or the missing car. Sheriff's deputies from a neighboring county brought in canine units hoping to pick up a scent. The Ohio State Highway Patrol ordered their aircraft to scan roads from above. The extensive search turned up no trace of Mrs. Loader or her car. Special collections were taken at restaurants and grocery stores to help pay for additional personnel. Deputies alerted the media while family members posted flyers in neighboring towns, hoping to get the word out beyond the local community.
Okay, thanks.
These gentlemen will help you.
Hi.
That afternoon, a woman who knew Mrs. Loader called the sheriff's office with information and came in for an interview.
Appreciate you coming in.
You know, I heard about Mrs. Loader's disappearance.
She told investigators that she'd seen Mrs. Loader's red Buick in town at about 11 p.m. the previous evening. She thought it was strange that the ailing woman would be driving that late. Though the light was dim, she could see that a young man was driving the car.
Bushy and thrown back.
The witness tried her best to help a police artist construct a composite sketch from what she could remember of the brief encounter.
Is that him?
In the area surrounding Port Washington, Ohio, concern that a criminal could be on the loose spread fear in a community that was not used to locking their doors. Police showed the composite sketch at every interview, but no one could identify the man depicted in the drawing. The day ended with no new leads. On day 2 of Mrs. Loader's disappearance, a deputy entered her case into the NCIC, the National Crime Information Center, a computer system linking 57,000 law enforcement agencies across the country.
Sheriff's Department.
That same day, the sheriff's office fielded a call from some concerned parents.
Can you describe him?
Their 16-year-old high school sophomore had also disappeared from Tuscarawas County.
Okay, his clothing, jeans.
In nearby Newcomerstown, 3 miles from the house where Mrs. Loader disappeared, a worried father and stepmother told a sheriff's deputy their son was missing. His family and his former employer had not heard from him for 3 days.
Red shirt. Do you have a picture of him?
Yes, I do.
One other thing too, officer.
A .22 caliber handgun was also missing from the house. The parents gave authorities a photograph of the missing boy, Eric Elliott.
It seemed kind of ironic at the time that we would have Mrs. Loader missing and that we would also have a juvenile reported missing within that short distance.
Ohio investigators wondered if there was any connection between the 2 disappearances from the same county. Just 36 hours after Mrs. Loader's abduction, Sheriff Wilson received another call.
Hello?
650 miles west in Fulton, Missouri, police found a red Buick stuck in a farmer's muddy field. When they ran its Ohio plates through the NCIC, they discovered it was Mrs. Loader's stolen car. The farmer had not seen who had abandoned it. The car's keys were missing, but the doors were unlocked. Among the items officers found inside was a green soda bottle and a sandwich wrapper labeled Goshen Dairy Store. They towed the vehicle to the station for further examination. Lieutenant Timothy Daimler from the Callaway County Sheriff's Office in Fulton, Missouri, was assigned to lead the investigation. His department's first task was to check the car's locked trunk.
We weren't sure exactly what we were going to find. We had a missing lady from Ohio, and this was her car, so we were under the assumption that very possibly we may find a body when we opened up the trunk.
Investigators needed to open it without damaging evidence or injuring the woman if she was unconscious inside. An auxiliary deputy who was a locksmith was called in. They discovered the trunk was empty. After 3 days of searching, hope of finding Mrs. Loader alive was beginning to fade. On September 1st, an FBI evidence recovery team from Kansas City was called in, since the missing woman's car had crossed state lines. Agents worked with local authorities processing Mrs. Loader's car for forensic details. They gathered several sets of prints and hairs. In Ohio, the foreign prints were entered into an automated fingerprint system, but no matches were found. Sheriff Wilson prepared to travel to Missouri. On a hunch, he took along a photo of the missing teenager, Eric Elliott.
At the time, it was nothing concrete as far as connecting Mrs. Loader's disappearance and Mr. Elliott's report of his son missing. However, I felt that since we're going to Callaway County, you know, it would make sense to maybe obtain a photograph of the missing juvenile and take with us.
Mrs. Loader's son-in-law joined the sheriff to help in the investigation.
See what we can do.
The Missouri official did not recognize the photo, but the Ohio sheriff did recognize the sandwich wrapper found in the car. It was from Goshen Dairy, a store near Mrs. Loader's house. Her son-in-law said the family kept her vehicle clean. Perhaps Eric Elliott, who also lived close to the store, had left the wrapper in the car.
They had a photograph of Elliott with them, and we decided to cover Kingdom City, where they would have gotten off the interstate.
Ohio and Missouri investigators checked exits along nearby I-70, a major east-west route in the region. They hoped someone at the rest stops would be able to confirm that Elliott had been in the area. They spoke to dozens of employees and travelers. Late in the afternoon, their efforts finally paid off.
You haven't seen him since then?
No, I haven't.
They found one person who remembered seeing the teenager the day before. Unfortunately, authorities found no one who remembered seeing Mrs. Loader or her car. For the first time, investigators considered 16-year-old Eric Elliott as a suspect in her abduction. Missouri deputies also continued to canvass the rural Fulton area, inquiring if neighbors had seen anything unusual. At the house closest to the field where Mrs. Loader's car was found, an officer knocked on the door of an elderly couple, William and Flossie Brewer. He heard their dog, but the couple appeared to be out. Since their car was not parked outside, the deputy continued on. Authorities checked dozens of homes, but found no one close by who had seen Eric Elliott or Mrs. Loader.
I was on my way home. After finishing that up, I received a page from the communications center that they wanted me to call them immediately. They told me that they had found two bodies at a farmhouse out on County Road 147.
It was the home of William and Flossie Brewer, the house closest to the field where Mrs. Loader's car was found earlier that day. Authorities believe the two crimes were likely connected. 3 days after Mrs. Loader's disappearance, sheriff's detectives found the bodies of 86-year-old William Brewer and his 76-year-old wife Flossie in the basement of their home. Each had multiple gunshot wounds.
They were slumped over. They were near the door. She had her hands tied behind her back, with what appeared to be a telephone cord, and he was on her right, slumped over also, and his cane was standing there right beside him.
The detective also found the couple's dog faithfully guarding their lifeless bodies. An autopsy later determined that both Mr. and Mrs. Brewer had each been shot 3 times in the head with a .22, the same caliber weapon missing from Eric Elliott's home. The 16-year-old suspected in the disappearance of Mrs. Loader now became a suspect in the double homicide.
There was no indication that the suspect had spent any length of time in the house before this occurred, so from the evidence it pointed us that it had happened relatively quickly.
Investigators found no signs of forced entry. In the basement, the door to the outside was covered with cobwebs, indicating it had not been opened.
It was yesterday. Now,
Investigators spoke with the brewer's son. He said the couple's Oldsmobile was missing, along with several rifles.
Missing from around the house.
All were entered into the NCIC.
Yeah, the gun's missing and the car.
The son added that his mother's bedspread was also missing. Technicians worked the scene until 5
Getting
a.m.
back to any items in the house. You said
On the floor near the front entrance, investigators found two distinct sets of footprints far into the house.
Did they keep a key for this? Typically?
One appeared to be a tennis shoe, the other a hiking boot. Investigators suspected the double homicide was likely connected to Mrs. Loader's disappearance.
No, just
What they didn't know was if 16-year-old Eric Elliott and a companion had become spree killers. By September 2nd, 1994, 4.5 days had passed since the ailing Ruth Loader was forced from her Ohio home without her medication. She was missing and presumed dead since her stolen car was found abandoned in Missouri, 150 yards from where police discovered a slain elderly couple. Authorities suspected an Ohio teenager named Eric Elliott and at least one companion were responsible for the crimes. But they had no direct evidence. Lieutenant Timothy Daimler of the Callaway County, Missouri Sheriff's Department recalled that citizens in the surrounding areas were stunned.
These are people that live in the rural community. They're used to leaving their doors unlocked. They do know everybody. And I think it was somewhat of a realization that, unfortunately, even though you do live in a rural community, that you still have to lock your doors and pay attention to when strangers are in your neighborhood.
With 2 confirmed homicides and a likely third in as many days, local authorities turned to the FBI for help. Special Agent Peter Christ of the FBI's Canton, Ohio resident agency was assigned the case. To catch up with the suspected spree killer and his companion, they needed an idea of where Eric Elliott might be heading.
So we were trying to get as much background information as we could. We were looking for relatives, uncles, aunts, cousins, friends. We were convinced that they were heading across the country, and we just needed to know everybody that there was a possibility that they would stop and visit, to either visit to say hello or get any kind of financial or moral support.
Can I call you TJ? Yeah, you seem like a nice enough.
Agents asked one of Eric Elliott's friends to come in for questioning. The friend told them that Elliott had recently become very close to a young ex-convict named Lewis Gilbert. He said that Gilbert and Elliott had spent a lot of time together over the past few weeks. Both had been complaining about how boring life was in the small town and that there was no reason for them to stay. Gilbert was estranged from his wife and son, and Elliott wished to visit his birth mother in California.
I just got out of jail. Hello?
The friend added that the pair mentioned they wanted to do something that would make them go down in history and planned to start by stealing a car.
They mentioned that. We were drinking and got the talk.
The last time he saw them was 5 days ago, when Gilbert and Elliott were walking along railroad tracks behind Mrs. Loader's house.
Acting kind of strange, out of the ordinary.
Because Elliott was a troubled teen, Agent Christ believed that he probably looked up to 22-year-old Lewis Gilbert, since Gilbert appeared to do as he pleased.
At the point when Gilbert befriended Elliott, he had been released from jail 2 weeks prior to that. Had a criminal history, had a history of getting in trouble. And at that point, we sort of felt that maybe Mr. Elliott was in awe or enamored with Mr. Gilbert because he did have that kind of criminal history background.
Investigators dug deeper into Lewis Gilbert's past. The 22-year-old had served time for stealing a boat and breaking and entering. He had also been convicted of physically abusing his 3-month-old son. Though agents still lacked concrete evidence that Gilbert and Elliott were traveling together, they needed to find them as soon as possible to prevent any more killing.
Our biggest concern at this point was that we suspected these two of Mrs. Loader's disappearance. They were strong suspects in the killings and the double homicide in Missouri, and we were very concerned that this kind of activity would continue all the way across the country.
Sheriff Wilson's first step was to see if anyone had seen Gilbert with Elliott at the Goshen Dairy store, close to Mrs. Loader's Ohio home. Missouri investigators had found a sandwich wrapper from the store in Mrs. Loader's abandoned vehicle.
Does this look familiar to you?
Yeah. One of our wrappers to our sandwich.
Okay,
The clerk identified the rapper. She also remembered selling the sandwich and some soda to Gilbert and Elliot just after Mrs. Loader disappeared. Authorities now had confirmation the young men were traveling together.
Thank you.
But 5 days had already passed since the spree killers had begun their cross-country rampage. The FBI quickly secured arrest warrants for kidnapping and burglary in the Ruth Loader disappearance. Though agents believed the pair was also responsible for the double homicide in Missouri, authorities still lacked evidence to formally charge them with those crimes.
That's the way he wants things.
Agents weren't about to wait for someone to call in. Anticipating Gilbert and Elliot's westward movement, the FBI visited Gilbert's mother in Tahlequah, Oklahoma on September 3, 1994. The agent warned her that her son and his friend were armed fugitives, suspected of driving a stolen Oldsmobile with Missouri plates. It was possible that the pair would visit her for help.
I need to know if you've seen them recently.
Oh, they just left this morning.
This morning?
Yes.
I see.
The FBI had just missed them. Gilbert and Elliot had arrived at 2 a.m. the previous day. Gilbert claimed the Oldsmobile they were driving belonged to a friend. They said they were headed to California. The pair spent the day and left a few hours before the agent arrived. Cooperating with the FBI, she described the clothes the pair was wearing and gave agents addresses of other relatives. Authorities feared that if they didn't catch up with them soon, the spree killers would strike again.
That was one of the most frustrating things about this whole investigation. It just appeared that we were always a half a day or a day behind them. And that's probably one of the most frustrating things. We just couldn't get ahead of them.
Because Eric Elliott was a minor, investigators needed court permission to distribute his photo. They got the go-ahead 36 hours after the double homicide in Missouri. Lieutenant Daimler added it to the nationwide bulletins for the fugitives.
I was scared to see where they were going to end up next and who they were going to kill next. And I wanted to do everything I could to help get those people off the street, because it was apparent to me that they didn't care who they killed.
Despite the best efforts of authorities, the urgent hunt for the suspected killers stretched into its 6th day. On September 4th, 1994, 165 miles west of Gilbert's mother's house in Oklahoma, a dirt biker was riding the rural trails around Draper Lake, just outside of Oklahoma City. His ride was cut short when he discovered a woman's body amongst the trees. As he raced to summon police, he rode around an Oldsmobile with Missouri plates. Almost a week after Mrs. Loader's abduction in Ohio, the nationwide hunt for 2 suspected killers would continue. By September 4th, 1994, 6 days had elapsed in the FBI's massive nationwide search for a pair of suspected spree killers. Lewis Gilbert and Eric Elliott were wanted for a possible murder in Ohio and a confirmed double homicide in Missouri. The fugitives were last seen in Oklahoma, heading west. That same day, Oklahoma City police responded to a call from a dirt biker who had discovered a woman's body near Draper Lake. Officers secured the crime scene, then called in homicide detectives. They interviewed the biker who had made the discovery. Homicide Inspector Bob Bemo of the Oklahoma City Police Department was assigned the case.
Once we come upon the immediate scene where the body was located, I observed the young woman to be in a kind of a bent over backwards and caught between a tree.
The victim was a white female in her 30s. Investigators found no identification on or near the body. But a manager at a nearby marina later identified her as his missing employee, Roxy Rudder.
As a part of our investigation, another vehicle had been found a short distance away from where the victim had been located. And we didn't know if this was a part of the crime or not, although we did secure the area around this vehicle.
When detectives checked the Oldsmobile's Missouri plates with the NCIC, they discovered the car had been reported stolen from the Brewers, the double homicide victims from Missouri. Oklahoma investigators immediately notified authorities back east. To Tuscarawas County Sheriff Walter Wilson in Ohio, it appeared that Gilbert and Elliott had struck again.
They had recovered Missouri's stolen vehicle, and they also had another murder victim. It's just another terrible feeling that's really hard to describe, that obviously this tragedy continues.
Oklahoma police crime technicians gathered evidence from the vehicle. They recovered several unused .22 caliber bullets. A pawn shop receipt from a local Oklahoma City store was also found. Prints lifted from inside and outside the car matched both Gilbert and Elliott's. Oklahoma medical examiners determined that Ruddle's death had occurred in the last day or two, since there was little decomposition. Death had been inflicted by a .22 caliber weapon. Detectives notified the woman's devastated husband. He informed them that her two-toned pickup truck was also missing. Investigators listed it as stolen and added its information to the growing NCIC report on Gilbert and Elliott. Detectives also took the receipt found in the Brewer's car to the Oklahoma City pawn shop that issued it. 2 video games and a socket wrench set had been pawned the day before the murdered woman was found. They showed the receipt to an employee. He vaguely remembered Gilbert and Elliott, but he had something else that might be stronger than memory. The pawn shop was equipped with a 24-hour surveillance camera. The videotape confirmed his story. September 3rd was the last confirmed sighting of Gilbert and Elliott. The FBI issued 2 more warrants for the suspected killers for unlawful interstate flight. Agent Peter Christ and his team were frustrated that after 6 days, 4 victims, and thousands of man-hours, the killers remained a half day ahead of the FBI.
A lot of things were going through my mind. Number one, we didn't want another double homicide, and we didn't want another killing anyplace. And we were, I guess, what I kept thinking about, what have I not done? What lead have I not sent out? Let me look everything over again to see maybe if we can somehow get ahead of these guys instead of being behind them for a half a day or a day.
The nationwide hunt for Gilbert and Elliott intensified. Law enforcement agencies mobilized additional helicopters to search for Roxy Ruddle's 2-toned pickup truck on routes heading west. Long-haul truck drivers were also notified to report any sightings on the road or at rest stops. Hundreds of calls poured into police in Oklahoma, Missouri, and Ohio.
Going to be a white male, 5'10", approximately 175 pounds.
But none led to the fugitives' immediate whereabouts.
Every time the phone rang, I was very concerned that it would be another body. And that's a terrible feeling when you're working a case like this, when you know what has happened up to that point and what you envision. The worst thing you can envision in your mind would happen is if this thing continued. So every time the phone rang and somebody said it was for me, that was my biggest fear. That was the first thing that came into my mind. Oh, we found another body.
The 2 suspected spree killers had chosen elderly people and women as their prey. And the FBI didn't know where or whom they would strike next. By September 5th, 1994, after a week of searching, the FBI and local law enforcement were no closer to finding 2 suspects in a killing spree that spanned 3 states. Agents believe that 22-year-old Lewis Gilbert and 16-year-old Eric Elliott were headed to the home of Elliott's mother in California, driving a stolen 2-toned pickup truck with Oklahoma plates. Missouri Lieutenant Timothy Daimler feared the murder suspects would kill again if they decided to steal another car as they traveled west.
I wasn't thinking serial killer at the time. I guess what was going through my mind at the time that was these guys didn't care who they killed, and I was thinking that we need to catch these people.
News reports and bulletins alerted people in western states that the suspected killers were headed their way, armed and dangerous. In New Mexico, State Police criminal agent Daniel Becker first heard about the fugitives through the media.
My initial thought was that the chances of them being apprehended in New Mexico were extremely slim because of the wide open spaces that we have and a relatively small amount of law enforcement that we have throughout the state.
The same day the reports began to hit the news in New Mexico, Gilbert and Elliot stopped at the rural home of an older couple 15 miles south of Santa Fe. They claimed that the stolen two-tone pickup truck was low on gas. The couple agreed to help. The fugitives said they were on their way to California, but the woman was suspicious since she didn't see any luggage in the truck. To her, they seemed jumpy and left in a hurry when they heard the noise of nearby construction workers.
State Police Santa Fe, this is Carmen.
The woman reported the sighting to the New Mexico State Police. But by the time units arrived to investigate, the two young men were nowhere in sight. The following morning of September 6th, a New Mexico man reported another sighting to police.
How you doing?
He claimed to have seen Gilbert and Elliot the previous night. The man told the officers that he first encountered them while driving on Highway 599 outside Santa Fe. The motorist saw two young hitchhikers and pulled over to pick them up.
How's it going?
Thanks for picking us up.
They said their pickup truck had gotten stuck in the mud. He didn't realize who they were until he saw their photos on the news the next morning, describing them as suspected killers.
Wanna know if they can get a ride to the mall.
The witness said he gave the pair a ride to the store where they bought food and gas. Later that night, he saw them again and drove them back to the place they had first met.
Hey, y'all drive safe, man. Get your truck down the truck there.
It was a desolate part of the highway. The officer needed a landmark to estimate where the motorist had dropped the fugitives. The man said it was close to a small overpass. In the chance that the fugitives were still in the area, he alerted all area law enforcement. The New Mexico State Police were aware they had to move fast. Two units raced to the location to conduct a search for any trace of the suspected murderers. They found the overpass in a remote area. Reports had warned that the Ohio men were armed. Gilbert and Elliot would be tired and desperate after running and hiding for 7 days with little money. Officers prepared for the worst.
Probably leave contact cover, okay? Once we got him, we'll give you the signal.
If the fugitives were still in the area, they had miles of shrubs and hills behind which they could conceal themselves and take aim at anyone approaching.
Just wait there. Exactly.
Officers were instructed to use extreme caution.
So you guys go on the north side, we're going on the south side, okay? Good luck.
You'll get my signal.
The team wanted to bring them back alive. They scanned the dust for footprints, food wrappers, and soda bottles. Anything that might indicate the suspected killers were still in the area. They approached one of 6 culverts underneath the highway. Carefully, they moved forward for a closer look. One officer spotted 2 men lying on the ground inside, apparently sleeping.
Hey, police! Put your hands up! Let me see your hands! Put your hands up! Put your hands up! Put up! Be smart! Put your hands up! Don't do it!
One of the startled men appeared to be groping for his gun in the dark. In the next split second, officers had to decide whether they needed to use deadly force to stop the suspected spree killers. On September 6, 1994, New Mexico State Police were within a few feet of murder suspects Lewis Gilbert and Eric Elliott. The fugitives reached for their weapons, but chose not to die. After a murder spree that took the lives of 4 victims in less than a week, the pair was arrested without a struggle. The 1,800-mile chase had ended. FBI Special Agent Peter Christ got the news of their arrest in Ohio.
My reaction, of course, when I received that news was a tremendous sigh of relief. The first thing I wanted to know was, after they'd been caught, were there any bodies, were there any unsolved homicides close to where they were arrested? Of course, the answer was no. Just a tremendous sigh of relief that this whole thing was finally over.
Officers recovered a .22 handgun and a green soda bottle at the campsite where the pair were apprehended. They also found the bedspread belonging to the murdered Mrs. Brewer. State police found Roxy Ruddle's stolen pickup 2 miles away near a racetrack in Santa Fe. Like their other 2 stolen vehicles, the truck was stuck in the mud. Examining fingerprints, crime scene and lab investigators matched personal items to the murdered woman in Oklahoma City. Investigators also found another green soda bottle, the same brand they had found under the culvert and in Ruth Loder's car. Eric Elliott and Lewis Gilbert were taken to the New Mexico State Police District Office in Santa Fe. If they could turn one against the other, their prosecution would be assured. 16-year-old Eric Elliott made one phone call to his father in Ohio and refused to say anything about the killings. Now it was Lewis Gilbert's turn. The ex-convict waived his rights and agreed to be interviewed. New Mexico State Police criminal agent Daniel Becker had little time to prepare.
Gilbert revealed very little during the first hour of our interview about these killings. A couple times he made mention of, I asked him if he had did this out of, for some justifiable reason, or if he's a cold-blooded killer. And he responded by saying, one of those.
Gilbert claimed that he didn't recall what had happened over the past 5 days.
Did you murder him?
He refused to say anything about the murders or Mrs. Loder's disappearance. Frustrated, the investigator left the room. A few moments alone was all Gilbert needed.
After we had taken our first break, Gilbert began to open up a little bit more, and he actually made an admission that he had killed between 1 and 5 people. And when I had asked him why he'd killed people, he said, for stupid reasons.
Gilbert began by recounting the day he met the woman in Oklahoma. He said that he and Elliot struck up a conversation with Roxy Ruddle when they found her fishing alone in a secluded area of Draper Lake near Oklahoma City. They told her that their car was stuck in the mud and needed a ride back to town. She offered to help and packed up her gear. Her pickup truck was parked just up the hill.
Give me the keys. Now, come on, quick. Tie her up.
When her back was turned, Gilbert pulled the .22 pistol Elliot had taken from his parents' Ohio home. Then Gilbert told Elliot to tie Ruddle's hands. Gilbert said Ruddle cried and asked them not to hurt her. Elliot stayed behind while Gilbert marched Ruddle into the woods. He told her to sit down at the base of a tree. Then he shot Roxy Ruddle. Now that Gilbert had admitted to one murder, the agent pressed him on the others. He asked the confessed killer to describe what had happened in Missouri the day before he got to Oklahoma.
Gilbert advised me that they had been traveling through the state of Missouri, and the evening before the murders, they had parked the stolen vehicle that they had obtained in Ohio in what I was led to believe was a field. And they'd slept in the vehicle overnight, and the following morning or afternoon when they were about to leave, they realized the vehicle was stuck. So they needed to get another vehicle.
As Missouri investigators believed, Gilbert and Elliot had simply walked to the closest house and saw a car in the driveway. It was the home of Mr. and Mrs. Brewer. Gilbert decided they'd ask to use the phone to call for a tow.
Hello, sir. How you doing? Oh, pretty good. We got our car. Thank you so much.
Wanting to help, the Brewers let the young men in.
Once inside, they learned that they didn't have a telephone book, so they couldn't come up with a number to call for a wrecker. And it's at that point that Gilbert told me that he decided, or they decided, that they were going to kill the Brewers.
Come on, move it.
They led the grandfather and grandmother into the basement.
Back to me. Keep going.
Then executed them. There was one more crime that Gilbert had not discussed.
We're walking down some railroad tracks.
The elderly cancer patient from Ohio, Mrs. Loader, was still missing and presumed dead.
See if we can get the keys for it.
No one knew what had become of her. On the evening of August 29th, 1994, Lewis Gilbert and Eric Elliott approached Mrs. Loader's Port Washington home to steal her car. Since no one answered when they knocked, they believed the house was empty.
Stick it in. Cheap house. Stick it in.
So they broke in to search for the car keys.
This old lady.
After 10 minutes, they still hadn't found the keys. As they rummaged through the living room, they were startled when Mrs. Loader suddenly appeared. He claimed Mrs. Loader was still alive when he locked her in the trunk of her car and sped off.
They got about 4 miles outside of town in a wooded area, and they pulled up alongside of a guardrail and parked, got outside. Gilbert told me that he opened the trunk and he picked up Mrs. Loader out of the trunk, and they took her off the road near the guardrail, about 5 feet from the side of the road.
Gilbert said he forced Mrs. Loader to walk away from the car. He said he shot her with the same .22 that had killed the others.
We drove a little ways and...
Gilbert had finished his description of the murders. But he hadn't told the agent where they could find the murdered Ohio woman.
We knew it was crucial to find Mrs. Loader's body, both as evidence so this murder could be prosecuted, and also just simply as closure for the family so that they could find her and make for proper arrangements for a funeral.
Gilbert gave authorities directions to find Mrs. Loader's remains. 50 people from the FBI and 12 different law enforcement and volunteer groups followed Gilbert's directions. They searched for the dead woman in fields and woods and hills for days. But the 79-year-old widow and mother of 4 was never found. Sheriff Walter Wilson continues to work the open case.
When you work a murder case, you almost become part of a family, so to speak, because your goal obviously is to solve the crime, to help the victims, the surviving victims, as much as you possibly can. It's something obviously that will never ever be forgotten. I have a high respect for the Loader family, having got to know them very well. I feel bad to this day that we've not yet been able to recover Mrs. Loader's remains.
16-year-old Eric Elliott stood trial as an adult in Oklahoma. Elliott was found guilty of first-degree murder for his participation in the killing of Roxy Ruddle. He was sentenced to life without parole. In Missouri, after 57 years of marriage, the Brewers were laid to rest. Unlike the family of Ruth Loader, the Brewer family was able to have some closure for their tragic loss. After being sentenced to death for the murder of Roxy Ruddle in Oklahoma, Lewis Gilbert was extradited to Missouri, where he stood trial for the murders of William and Flossie Brewer.
Lewis, where's Ruth? Where's the lady in Ohio? Where's Ruth, Lewis? Give her family a break.
He remained silent on the whereabouts of Ruth Loader's remains. Since the Ohio woman has not yet been recovered, there has been no trial date set to answer for her kidnapping and murder. For her family and friends, Gilbert and Elliott's actions are unconscionable.
I've often thought what goes through their mind or what causes them to do that, and I really, it's hard to understand or think what they're thinking, other than obviously they have to be very evil people.